I got fined $300 for a wind chime. Just one. And by the time it was over, the guy who fined me lost his job, his reputation, and very possibly his career, all because he thought nobody would ever push back. The thing is, I wasn't planning to start anything. I wasn't trying to make a point. I just wanted to sit on my porch after work, listen to that soft little clink in the breeze, and forget about spreadsheets and deadlines for a while. But some people don't like quiet peace unless they're the ones controlling it. So this all happened in a neighborhood called Ridgeview Estates, just outside a mid-sized town where everything looks nice on the surface, trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, that kind of place where you assume things run smoothly. Until you realize they run smoothly, because one guy makes all the decisions. His name was Victor Langley, and if you lived there more than a week, you knew exactly who he was. He was the HOA president, but honestly, that title didn't even begin to cover it. Victor acted like he owned the entire neighborhood, like every blade of grass and every fence post somehow reported directly to him. You'd see him walking around early in the mornings with a clipboard, always the same posture, chin slightly raised, scanning everything like he was inspecting troops, not homes, and people adjusted when he walked by. I'm not exaggerating. Conversations would soften. Folks would suddenly remember something they needed to do inside. Nobody really liked him, but nobody wanted trouble either. And in a place run by rules, the guy who enforces them becomes someone you don't challenge lightly. Now me, I'd only been there about 6 months. I moved in after a long stretch of working nonstop, finally got a place with a porch, something I'd wanted for years, and the first thing I bought wasn't a grill or patio furniture. It was a wind chime. Nothing fancy, just a clean, soft tone, the kind that blends into the air instead of cutting through it. It made the evenings feel settled, like I could finally breathe a little. And for a while, that's all it was. No complaints, no comments, just me, a glass of iced tea, and that quiet sound in the background. Until one morning, 7 a.m. sharp. I opened my front door and found an envelope taped dead center like it was meant to be seen from across the street. Inside was a violation notice. $300. Reason: excessive noise from exterior decoration. I remember just standing there for a second, reading it twice because it didn't make sense. Excessive noise? From that, I actually stepped back outside, like maybe something had changed overnight, like the thing had suddenly turned into a church bell. But no, it was the same soft chime, barely noticeable unless you were sitting right there. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I went to talk to him. Victor was already out, of course, doing his rounds, clipboard in hand like always. I walked up, said good morning, tried to keep it polite, because at that point I still thought this was some kind of misunderstanding. "Hey, I got this notice," I said, holding it up, "about the wind chime. There's got to be a mistake." He didn't even look at me right away. Just flipped a page on his clipboard, made a note about something else, then finally glanced up like I'd interrupted something important. "There's no mistake," he said, flat, like he'd said it 100 times before. I let out a small laugh, not because it was funny, but because it felt absurd. "It barely makes any noise." "Noise is subjective," he replied, already looking back down at his clipboard. "The rule is there for a reason." "Okay, but what rule?" I asked. "Can you show me where wind chimes aren't allowed?" That's when he finally looked at me properly, and there was something in his expression, not anger, not even annoyance, just this quiet certainty that the conversation was already over. "You're welcome to appeal," he said. "Otherwise, payment is due within 10 days. And then he walked past me, just like that. No discussion, no explanation, just done. I stood there for a second longer than I probably should have, feeling that mix of confusion and irritation starting to settle in. Because it wasn't about the $300, not really. It was about the way he handled it. Like I didn't matter, like the decision had already been made before I even knew there was an issue. So yeah, I paid it. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted to understand what just happened before I decided what to do next. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table with the HOA bylaws, all of them. Not just skimming, not just looking for keywords. I read every page, every clause, every little footnote like it was a contract I was about to sign with my own money on the line, which, in a way, it was. And here's the thing, wind chimes weren't banned. Not even close. There was a section about noise, sure, but it was specific. Any violation had to exceed 65 decibels and had to be verified, documented, not just someone deciding they didn't like the sound of something. That's not a suggestion, that's a requirement. So the next day, I drove out and bought a decibel meter. Cost me $22. Brought it home, hung the chime, waited for a steady breeze, and measured it properly, 38 decibels. I took photos, time-stamped everything, documented it like I would any financial record, because that's what I do for a living. I'm a CPA. Been doing it for almost 2 decades. Numbers don't lie, but people get creative when they think no one's checking. And sitting there that night, looking at the bylaws on one side and the readings on the other, I had this moment where everything just clicked. This wasn't about a wind chime. It never was. This was about control. And once you see that clearly, you stop reacting like a neighbor, and you start thinking like someone who understands systems. I remember leaning back in my chair, tapping that pen against the table, and thinking, okay, if we're going to play by the rules, then let's really play by the rules. That's when the idea hit me. Not all at once, more like it built itself piece by piece, slow, deliberate, and honestly, a little bit satisfying. If one wind chime was a problem, what about more? As long as every single one of them stayed within the rules he claimed to enforce. I didn't rush it. I made a list, checked specifications, made sure everything I ordered complied exactly with the bylaws. Same type, same sound range. Nothing that could even remotely be argued as excessive. And then, I placed the order. 27 sets. Not to break the rules, but to prove a point he didn't think anyone would bother proving. The boxes started showing up 2 days later, one after another, stacked neatly by my front door like some kind of quiet rebellion waiting to happen. And I'll admit, there was a moment, standing there looking at all 27 of them, where I almost laughed, not because it was ridiculous, although it kind of was, but because I knew exactly how this was going to play out, at least the first part of it. Victor wasn't the type to reconsider, he was the type to double down, and I was counting on that. I didn't install them right away. I waited until late afternoon, when most people were either home from work or just settling into their evening routines, not for attention exactly, but because I didn't want this to feel sneaky. If anything, I wanted it to be visible, deliberate, undeniable. Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down was watering her plants when I started hanging the first set. She gave me that polite neighbor smile at first, the kind that says, I see you, but I'm not asking questions. But by the time I got to number 5, she set the hose down and just watched, head tilted slightly. You opening a music shop? She called out, half joking. Something like that, I said, smiling back. By the time I hit 10, a couple of other neighbors had slowed their walks, pretending to check their phones or adjust their shoes while very obviously trying to figure out what I was doing. And the thing is, the sound didn't explode into chaos like you might expect. It stayed soft, layered, almost like background texture, a gentle shifting tone that came and went with the breeze. If anything, it sounded peaceful, calmer than I expected. I finished just before sunset. 27 wind chimes, evenly spaced, all within code, all documented, every single one compliant. I stepped back, took a few photos, and for a brief second, I just stood there listening. It didn't feel like defiance in that moment. It felt like balance. The next morning, Victor showed up earlier than usual. I saw him from the window, walking up the sidewalk, that same clipboard in hand, but his pace was different this time, quicker, sharper, like he already knew something was off. He stopped at the edge of my yard, and I watched his eyes move across the porch, counting, calculating, trying to process what he was seeing. I stepped outside before he could knock. Morning, I said. He didn't return it. What is this? He asked, gesturing toward the porch like I'd set up a circus overnight. Wind chimes, I said calmly. All within the noise limit. I checked. His jaw tightened just slightly. Not a full reaction, just enough to show the gears were turning. This is excessive, he said. Show me where it says there's a limit on quantity, I replied. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. You're creating a disturbance, he said finally, shifting the argument. 38 decibels each, I said, already holding my phone with the readings pulled up. Even combined, they don't exceed the threshold. And the bylaws are pretty clear, verified readings over 65 are required for a violation. He looked at the screen, then back at me, and for a split second, I could see it. Not uncertainty, not exactly, but resistance meeting something it couldn't immediately override. You'll be hearing from the board, he said. And just like before, He turned and walked away. Except this time, it didn't feel like he was in control of the conversation anymore. The notices started coming in 3 days later. Not one, not two, 8 separate violations, each one $300, spaced out just enough to look procedural but clearly targeting the same thing. Decorations creating a nuisance. Excessive auditory impact. Language that sounded official but didn't actually line up with the bylaws when you read it carefully. $2,400. Added to the original $300, $2,700 total. I lined them up on my kitchen counter, one next to the other, and just stared at them for a while, letting the weight of it settle in. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because this was the moment where a lot of people would back down. Pay it, remove the chimes, move on. And honestly, I get that. Most people don't have the time or the energy to fight something like this, especially when it's designed to wear you down. But here's the part Victor didn't know, or maybe didn't think mattered. This wasn't outside my skill set. For 19 years, I've worked as a CPA. I deal with numbers, audits, compliance, discrepancies. I've seen what happens when people think small shortcuts won't get noticed, when systems go unchecked long enough that they start bending around whoever's in charge. And the one thing that's always true, if you follow the paper trail far enough, it tells you everything. So I stopped thinking about this as a neighbor dispute, and I started treating it like an audit. The first step was simple. Under state law, homeowners have the right to request financial records from the HOA. It's not optional, it's not a favor, it's a requirement. So I drafted a formal request, precise, professional, no emotion, just facts and deadlines, and I submitted it through the proper channels. Victor had 30 days to respond. He waited until day 29. Of course he did. The envelope was thicker than I expected, a full set of financial statements, vendor payments, summaries, everything you'd expect on the surface. Clean formatting, organized sections, the kind of presentation that looks reassuring if you don't dig too deep. I took it to my desk, sat down, and started going through it line by line, not rushing, not skimming, just reading, the way I always do. At first, nothing jumped out. Routine expenses, maintenance costs, utilities, all within a reasonable range. But then I hit page 4. Cedar Ridge Landscaping Services. $47,000 paid out over 18 months. I paused there, just looking at the number, not because it was impossible, but because it felt off. Landscaping contracts in neighborhoods this size don't usually land that high unless there's something unusual going on. So I kept reading. No competitive bids listed. No board vote recorded. No conflict of interest disclosure. That's when the feeling shifted from curiosity to focus. I pulled up comparable contracts from nearby communities, one similar in size, similar layout, similar needs. It didn't take long. 3 solid examples, all within a tight range. Average cost, $15,800. I leaned back in my chair, doing the math in my head before even writing it down. That's a gap of over $30,000. Not once, but across a consistent pattern of payments. Now at this point, you have a few possibilities. Maybe it's a premium service. Maybe there's something included that isn't obvious. Or maybe there's a reason it wasn't put out for bid. So I looked up the company. Cedar Ridge Landscaping Services had been registered just 6 weeks before its first invoice to the HOA. Single listed owner. Name, Daniel Mercer. And that name didn't mean anything to me until I cross-referenced it. Daniel Mercer was Victor's son-in-law. I actually sat there for a second, hands resting on the desk, just letting that settle in, because this wasn't a gray area anymore. This wasn't interpretation or opinion or neighborhood politics. This was a direct financial relationship that hadn't been disclosed, tied to payments significantly above market rate, approved without proper procedure. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern. And patterns are what audits are built on. I printed everything. Not just the statements, but the comparisons, the registration records, timelines. I tabbed it, labeled it, organized it in a way that told the story without me having to raise my voice. Because the truth doesn't need volume, it needs clarity. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't showing up to ask questions. I was showing up with answers. Thursday night came with that usual quiet tension these meetings always have. Folding chairs lined up in neat rows, people filing in with polite nods and small talk that never really goes anywhere, like everyone's waiting for something but no one wants to say it out loud. I walked in a little early, folder in hand, not trying to draw attention, just taking a seat near the middle where I could see the board clearly, and where they could see me if they chose to. Victor was already up front, of course, setting his papers in order, speaking quietly with two board members like everything was routine, like nothing had shifted, like he still controlled the room the same way he always had. And maybe, up until that moment, he did. I noticed a few neighbors glance at my folder, then at me, then back again. That subtle curiosity people try to hide but can't quite manage. Mrs. Alvarez gave me a small nod when she walked past. Not a question, just support. In that quiet way people show it when they're not sure what's about to happen, but they know it matters. The meeting started like they always do. Minutes from the last session, budget updates, minor complaints about parking and paint colors, the kind of things that fill time but don't really move anything forward. Victor ran it the same way he always had, steady voice, controlled pace, cutting off discussions just before they got too long, guiding everything back to his version of order. And I just sat there, listening, waiting. When they opened the floor for homeowner comments, there was that brief hesitation, the usual pause where people consider speaking and then decide not to, and that's when I stood up. You could feel the shift immediately. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, just attention turning in a single direction. I walked to the front, set the folder down on the table, and for a second, I just looked at Victor. Not angry, not confrontational, just steady. I requested the HOA financial records 30 days ago. I said, voice calm, even. And I received them. He didn't respond right away, but I could see it, that flicker of recognition, like he knew exactly where this might be going, but wasn't sure how far I'd take it. I went through them carefully. I continued, opening the folder, flipping to a marked page. And I found something I think the entire community deserves to understand. One of the board members shifted in his seat. Another leaned forward slightly. The room got quieter, not silent, but close. The HOA paid $47,000 to a company called Cedar Ridge Landscaping over the past 18 months, I said, letting the number sit there for a moment. There's no record of a competitive bid, no board vote approving the contract, and no disclosure of any potential conflict of interest. Victor leaned back in his chair, arms crossing slowly, like he was preparing to shut this down. You're out of order, he said, voice firm. This isn't. I didn't raise my voice. I just kept going. The owner of that company is Daniel Mercer, I said, sliding a printed document across the table. Your son-in-law. That's when the room changed. Not all at once. Not like a movie scene where everyone gasps in sync. It was more subtle than that. Chairs shifting, people leaning toward each other, whispers starting to form, the kind of reaction that builds instead of explodes. Victor didn't pick up the paper. That's irrelevant, he said, sharper now. The services were rendered at nearly 3 times the market rate. I replied, placing another set of documents down. Comparable contracts from 3 nearby communities average $15,800 for identical services. One of the board members, a woman named Karen who'd barely spoken in any meeting I'd attended, reached for the papers, scanning them quickly, her expression tightening with every line. This meeting is adjourned, Victor said suddenly, pushing his chair back. But no one stood up. That was the moment, the exact second where everything shifted from his control to something else entirely. 41 homeowners in that room, and not one of them moved. Karen looked up from the documents, then at the rest of the board. We're not adjourning, she said, voice steady but unmistakably firm. Not yet. Victor's jaw tightened. That's not your call. It is if we vote, another board member added quietly. And just like that, the structure he'd relied on, the system he thought he controlled, started to turn. They didn't argue for long. They didn't need to. A motion was made to remove him as president pending further investigation. The vote was 4-1. Victor sat there for a second after it was done, like the result hadn't fully landed yet, like maybe if he didn't react, it wouldn't be real. But eventually, he stood up, gathered his papers without saying a word, and walked out of the room the same way he'd walked away from me that morning weeks ago. Only this time, no one followed. The rest moved quickly after that. The financial records were forwarded to the state attorney general's office, flagged for breach of fiduciary duty and potential fraud. An external audit was requested. His real estate license, under review. And me? I went home that night, sat on my porch, and listened. 27 wind chimes, moving gently in the evening air, the same soft layered sound I'd heard before, except now it carried something different. Not victory exactly, not revenge, just clarity. Because this was never really about the chimes. It was about what happens when someone gets too comfortable making decisions no one questions, and what happens when someone finally does. A few days later, Mrs. Alvarez stopped by again, this time not just to watch. "You keeping all of them?" she asked, nodding toward the porch. I looked out at them, catching the light, shifting with the breeze. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." She smiled. "They sound nicer than I expected." "Yeah," I said, leaning back in my chair. "They do." The fines? Still technically on record. $2,700 for something that never actually broke the rules. And here's the part one keep thinking about. If I had just paid it, taken them down, let it go, none of this would have come out. No one would have looked at those numbers. No one would have asked those questions. And Victor would still be running the place the same way he always had. So now I'm curious. If someone went through your HOA's financials, line by line, no assumptions, no shortcuts, what would they find? Would everything make sense? Or would something not quite add up? Let me know what you think, because I have a feeling this kind of story isn't as rare as people like to believe.